Welcome back to our series on what is a Germany. Last time we gave a bit of an introduction and talked about the Roman era Germanic peoples and ended with Charlemagne, who, fun fact, despite being most well known by a French name, actually natively spoke a Dutch language and later learned to speak Latin and a little Greek. Anyway, you may know in 840 AD, Charlemagne's son, Emperor Louis the Pious, counted as Louis the First of France, the first of 18, dies. A couple years later, in 843, his sons divide up the Frankish Empire. Charles the Bald becomes ruler of what will one day become France as Charles II. His granddad was the first. Lothair gets the middle section, running along the Netherlands, Belgium, the Rhineland of Germany, the eastern third of France, and finally northern Italy. And Louis, named after his daddy, becomes ruler of the lands east of the Rhine as Louis or Ludwig II. The next 100 years see the brothers and their descendants jockeying for each other's lands. It's a complicated story, but finally two cores coalesce: France in the west and Germany in the east. And that's right, I said Germany. Otto the Great is crowned emperor in 962. We know him as the first Holy Roman Emperor, and his realm the Holy Roman Empire. I know the Voltaire quote, but in the 10th century it was an empire, even if it might not have been strictly Roman, and how holy it was is left to your own judgment. The empire had two major areas, later expanded to four. The first was Italy, where Rome and the Pope were, pretty important for their legitimacy, but ultimately proved a grave distraction from the real center of power, Germany. At some point, around the 10th or 11th centuries, East Francia came to be known as Germany, land of the Germans, or Deutsch, as we're calling them. France ended up taking the Frankish name, but Germany kept the homelands of the Frankish people. It's very complicated. And you may notice that medieval Germany is kind of similar in shape to modern Germany, just a little further to the west. Not everyone in this territory spoke Deutsch, but most did, and these people were what you would call Germans, medieval Germans anyway, before the emergence of the Netherlands, Austria, Luxembourg, etc. So, what happened? Seems like we're set up for Big Germany in 1000 AD. I would love to discuss the finer points of the Holy Roman Empire's constitution, and all the struggles between emperors and popes and princes for power and influence throughout the Middle Ages, but I'll have to be relatively concise. First of all, the HRE was not a German empire. It was ruled by Deutsch emperors, for the most part, and comprised Germany. But first and foremost, it transcended simple ethnic lines. It was the Christian empire, and its subjects ought to be Christians first and foremost. In 1002, the Duchy of Bohemia is brought into the fold as a fief of the empire. This is modern-day Czechia, and back then, as now, they spoke a Western Slavic language, later to evolve into modern Czech. In 1032, the empire acquires Burgundy in modern southeastern France, giving it better borders so it looks less top-heavy. But Burgundy was mostly Romance-speaking, later evolving into Provençal and Arpitan, both spoken in France today, but are patently not French. So already we have Italians in the south, Provençals and other Romance speakers to the west, and Lorraine and Wallonia, Slavs to the east, and Germans in the center. To the north was the border with the Danes, which leads into a quick tangent regarding the Norse. We all know the Vikings, big, scary, sea-going raiders that raped and plundered and all that jazz. They, too, were Germanics, but remained pagan as the Deutsch were Christianized during the early Middle Ages. By the 11th century, the Norse had settled down and formed into the three Scandinavian kingdoms of Denmark, Sweden, and Norway. When they accepted Latin Christianity, it was as independent kingdoms, not fiefs of the empire, as the Bohemians had, or even the Polish at first did. Thus, the three Scandinavian kingdoms evolved identities separate from the Deutsch. Even their languages were sufficiently different, belonging to the northern branch. Cross them off the list of potential Germans. And another quick aside for the English. According to the traditions and conventional historiography, Angles and Saxons, and some Jutes from Denmark, landed in southern Britain in the 5th century, conquering, assimilating, living, I guess, until the majority of the southern part of the island spoke their language, a form of Germanic that evolved into Old English, and their country became England after the Angles. While converted to Christianity during the early Middle Ages, the Anglo-Saxons really kind of were on the edge of the general European sphere of culture until in 1066 the Norman conquest dragged them kicking and screaming into affairs with the continent, specifically France. While the English are arguably closer to the Dutch than the Norse were, the lack of an explicit German identity for the empire and of political control meant the English never joined their language brothers on the mainland. The French, instead, would, both as rulers and enemies, help foster a separate English identity. So, we have a Holy Roman Empire, which is only partially German, and doesn't really try to make the rest of it German. It ruled in Latin, really, and regions and fiefs had such autonomy that Romance and Slavic sections kept their languages and customs, with some exceptions. In the time of Charlemagne, the river Elbe was basically the limit of the Dutch people, but the High Middle Ages saw the Ostsiedlung, the East settling. This was a long and steady colonization and assimilation of the Slavic regions of the empire. It was both directed by rulers and occurred naturally by people wanting better opportunities. It both involved the settling of largely empty lands and of fully occupied lands. It involved peaceful intermarriage and assimilation and naked, brutal conquest. Like all movements of peoples throughout history, it was complicated. The result was the settling of the former Slavic, or Wendish, marches of the East with Dutch people, pushing the limits of Germany into modern Austria, Brandenburg, Pomerania, and into the Polish region of Silesia. Despite being a major fief of the empire, and later a kingdom, Bohemia also saw its fringes fill with Germans, the Sudetenland that would cause some grief centuries later. Despite the pushing back of Slavic language and culture, this wasn't always unwelcome. At least the Slavic rulers of Mecklenburg and Bohemia appreciated German settlers for their technical skills and money. Many were part of the rising middle class, many Jewish as well, pioneering banking in these areas. The King of Hungary even invited Germans to settle his region of Transylvania. In the 13th century, as any fan of Medieval II Total War ought to know, the largely German Holy Order of the Brothers of the German House of St. Mary in Jerusalem, or the Teutonic Knights, were sent on a crusade against the Baltic pagans of modern Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia at the request of the King of Poland. These conquests opened new lands to German settlements, and so-called Baltic Germans became an important minority in the regions, controlling commerce and governance in the cities of Livonia, even after Tsarist Russia conquered the Baltic. So, by the 14th century, we have medieval Germany, including Switzerland, the Netherlands, Alsace and Lorraine, Austria, South Tyrol, and others, and a bunch of Dutch people living outside the empire in Hungary, Poland, France, and Flanders, and the Baltic. Seems like we're set up for even more big Germany. But by now, the constant squabbles over power in the empire, territorial and legal concessions given to the rulers of the various regions, and the effective loss of most of the emperor's power meant the Holy Roman Empire wasn't a Germany and wasn't a nation, as places like France and England were evolving into. Dynastic successions and feudal rights determined who owned what, not the language and culture of the inhabitants. And this geopolitical fact of medieval and early modern Europe would lead to the steady alienation of both Dutch and non-Dutch lands and peoples from the empire, steadily shrinking Germany to a modern and familiar shape. Next time, we'll look at this process and answer a few questions we posed at the beginning of the series. Until then, thanks for watching. Bye-bye.